The night was eerily quiet, the streetlights flickering against the cold pavement. A woman walking home from work glanced down and froze. There, lying on the sidewalk, was a tiny bundle. At first, she thought it was just a pile of blankets left behind, but then a small movement. A soft, almost inaudible whimper. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. It was a baby. Alone. Shocked and trembling, she crouched down, her mind racing. Who would leave a newborn like this? Was the mother in trouble? Was someone watching from the shadows? The infant, wrapped in a thin cloth, shivered against the night air. The woman's hands hovered, unsure whether to pick up the child or call for help. But one thing was clear: this baby had been abandoned. Within minutes, sirens cut through the silence as authorities arrived, their flashlights scanning the empty streets for any sign of who might have left the child there. Questions swirled. Why this location? Was this a desperate act or something more sinister? As officers secured the scene and paramedics examined the baby, one thing became apparent: this was only the beginning of a mystery far deeper than anyone expected. The officers exchanged uneasy glances as they scanned the desolate street, their radios crackling with updates. The infant, barely a few hours old, let out a feeble cry as the paramedics swaddled them in a warm blanket. The woman who had found the baby stood nearby, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her breath still unsteady. One of the officers, a seasoned detective with years of experience, knelt beside the sidewalk, examining the spot where the baby had been left. There were no footprints, no discarded belongings, nothing to indicate who might have placed the child there. But the location itself was strange. It wasn't just some random street. It was near an old, rundown apartment complex, one that had seen its fair share of crime over the years. A few curious onlookers had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some claimed they hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. Others whispered rumors, stories of strange happenings in the area, of people who had disappeared without a trace. But none of it explained how a newborn had ended up alone in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors worked to ensure the baby was stable. The child was small, malnourished, and showed signs of having been born without proper medical care. Yet there was something else: a tiny bracelet around the baby's wrist. It was handmade, with a single bead that bore an initial. The nurse examining it furrowed her brows. It was a small detail, but it could be a clue. Back at the scene, the detective ordered a search of the surrounding area. Officers combed through alleys, checked security cameras, and knocked on doors. One building in particular caught their attention: a boarded-up house a few blocks away. It had been abandoned for years, but recently, some neighbors had reported flickering lights inside late at night. Could it be connected? As the investigation deepened, another piece of the puzzle emerged. A woman had been seen in the area earlier that evening, walking quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. Security footage from a nearby gas station captured her face, though it was partially obscured by a hood. She had purchased only a single item, a bottle of water, before vanishing into the night. Who was she? And more importantly, was she the mother? The tension grew as authorities tried to track her down. Every step forward only led to more questions. Witnesses provided conflicting statements, and the few leads they had seemed to dissolve into dead ends. Then, a break in the case. A local social worker, upon hearing the news, reached out to the police with a troubling story. A few weeks ago, a young woman had come to her office, desperate and scared. She had refused to give her real name, but had spoken about being trapped in a dangerous situation, one she couldn't escape from. And the most chilling part? She had been pregnant. As officers worked to piece together her identity, they made another unsettling discovery. The bracelet found on the baby's wrist matched one that had been given to young girls in a nearby foster home, a home with a history of children running away. Had the mother been one of them? Had she fled from something terrible, only to be forced into an impossible choice? As the pieces of the puzzle began to form a picture, a sudden urgency filled the air. If the mother had been in danger, was she still alive? And if she wasn't the one who left the baby, then who did? Unanswered questions loomed, each more haunting than the last. But one thing was certain: this mystery was far from over. The detective sat at his desk, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the scattered case files. The discovery of the baby had shaken the entire department, but it was the mystery of the mother that gnawed at him the most. The lead about the foster home had sent officers digging through old records, trying to identify any young woman who might have recently been pregnant. The institution had a troubled past: numerous runaways, reports of neglect, and a revolving door of social workers who never stayed long enough to make a difference. It wasn't surprising that someone from there could have slipped through the cracks. Then, finally, a breakthrough. A former resident, a girl who had aged out of the system just months ago, matched the description of the woman seen on the security footage. Her name was Ayanna. She had spent years bouncing between group homes and temporary placements before disappearing from the system entirely. The last known address on file for her was a shelter downtown, but she had left without notice, vanishing without a trace. Officers immediately started searching for her, canvassing shelters, checking surveillance footage, and interviewing anyone who might have seen her. Days passed with little progress, and the sense of urgency grew. If she had abandoned her child, what kind of situation was she running from? And if she was in danger, every passing moment mattered. Then, a call came in. A woman matching Ayanna's description had been seen at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. By the time officers arrived, the room was empty, but they found something chilling. The walls were covered in scribbled notes, frantic messages written on scraps of paper. Some were names, others were warnings. And in the center of it all, one sentence stood out: "They found me." The detective's gut twisted. Whoever she was running from had caught up with her. And now, she was gone again. Back at the hospital, the baby, now stable, had been placed in temporary custody while authorities searched for relatives. The small bracelet with the initial remained a key piece of evidence. After hours of digging, they finally made a connection. The initials matched a woman who had once lived in the same foster home as Ayanna, a woman who had died under mysterious circumstances years ago. The implications were unsettling. Was Ayanna connected to something far bigger than just a runaway case? As the detective followed the tangled web of connections, an unsettling pattern emerged. Several young women who had once lived in the same foster home had gone missing over the years, their disappearances largely overlooked. No police reports, no investigations, just girls who had seemingly vanished. And now Ayanna was one of them. Determined to find answers, the detective traced her last known contacts. One name kept surfacing: a man who had once been involved with the foster home, a shadowy figure known for preying on vulnerable girls. If Ayanna had crossed paths with him, she could be in grave danger. Meanwhile, Ayanna was on the run. She had managed to slip away just before the officers arrived at the motel, her instincts honed by years of surviving in a world that had never protected her. She knew they were closing in, not just the police, but the people she had been running from for so long. She had never wanted to abandon her baby, but she had no choice. If they had found her with the child, neither of them would have been safe. She clutched a torn piece of paper in her pocket, the last photograph she had of her own mother, a woman she barely remembered. The same bracelet that had been found on the baby's wrist was in the photo, worn by her mother decades ago. The connection was deeper than she had realized. Desperation pushed her forward. She had to find a way to expose the truth before it was too late. She reached out to the only person she thought she could trust, a former social worker who had tried to help her once before. Through a series of secret messages, she arranged a meeting. But she never made it. When authorities traced her location, they found the alleyway where she had been last seen. There were signs of a struggle, scattered belongings, a ripped jacket, and traces of blood. The tension in the air was suffocating. The detective refused to let this end like all the other cases. He pushed harder, following the only lead they had left: a hidden property connected to the man who had once controlled the foster home. If Ayanna was still alive, this was where she would be. A raid was planned, executed with precision and urgency. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, held more secrets than anyone had imagined. Inside, they found more than just Ayana. Several missing girls, all with stories eerily similar to hers, had been held there, trapped in a cycle of fear. And in the center of it all, Ayana, barely conscious but alive. The moment she was rescued, the weight of the past years crashed down on her. She was safe. But more importantly, her baby was safe. In the weeks that followed, justice came swiftly. The foster home's dark history was exposed, its network dismantled, and those responsible faced consequences. Ayana, though scarred, began to rebuild her life. She was given the chance to reunite with her child, to break the cycle that had threatened to consume her. As the detective closed the case file, he knew this was more than just another investigation. It was a fight for those who had been forgotten, for the ones who had fallen through the cracks. And though this battle had been won, the larger war against injustice was far from over. For Ayana and her child, it was a second chance. A new beginning. A story of survival, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child.